First of all, again, just want to say welcome. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Tyler Karaopoulos, the president of Great Western Recreation. We're an entity that does work here with play areas and other products and services in the Pacific Northwest amongst the entire Western United States, actually. I've been a certified playground safety inspector, CPSI, since 1998, I believe. So it's been going on for quite some time, and we're excited about some of the new changes. In fact, I just renewed mine on Monday. So it's some of the topics here when it comes to playground inspection and maintenance with the ASTM and CPSC standards are fairly fresh in my mind. This presentation is kind of put together through CORE. CORE is the Center for Outreach, Research, and Education. It's a subsidiary department of PlayCorps. And the CORE group, just to give you a backdrop of what they do, is they provide education and guidance and research that they put together with a bunch of partnerships through professionals in the field and educational and academic institutions. So here's just an example of a lot of the different curriculum that's made available that the CORE group has. They do at least a couple of sessions as well, and I'll show you some of those details here in a minute, just to kind of give you an idea. If you're ever looking for additional education on various topics, they also provide these CEU credits in case that's a requirement that you need for continued education. A lot of different areas when it comes to outdoor environments, outdoor recreation environments. So whether that's playground maintenance, like we'll talk about today, whether that's Make a Stand is a guidebook and safety on bleacher systems, for example, which can be something worth looking into, or bike, shift into gears about bike lanes and bike parking, and then a lot of different best guides and practices. So some of this stuff, sort of ancillary to what you do, but a lot of it is available. In fact, recently they've been partnering with a gentleman named Bill Botten, who was on the U.S. Access Board, and they've been doing multiple trainings, a sort of in-depth dive into the Department of Justice ADA regulations as they pertain to outdoor environments. So, and that's been a very, very fascinating and very sort of in-depth approach on looking at the overall area as it pertains to ADA and sort of our responsibilities in making sure that the areas that we maintain are up to those codes. So again, these are a couple. There's a playground supervision and a playground maintenance one. I sent out, this is the guidebook that I just sent out to everybody, is the one for maintenance. If you do want the one for supervision, I can send that out as well. That's a little bit more geared towards if you have playground monitors or folks that are working at the schools and watching the children playing, kind of some of the best practices and resources and supervision. So that one's a slightly different one, but we're talking today more about inspections, maintenance, and sort of keeping things up to speed. So that is out. This was originally put together by the Hendys, who were playground inspectors for many, many years. The outline of this particular course is going to talk about why inspection maintenance is important. What are our management staffing priorities? What is a maintenance inspection? What's required? And then there's going to be some offshoots on some of the newer trends you start to see with like natural play spaces and some of the stuff that's on the fringe and the gray area of some of the ASTM codes, and then a variety of resources that we'll dive into. So just an overview of some of the learning objectives. We're going to define the importance of playground maintenance, key to managing risk. We're going to go into some of the low frequency and high frequency inspections, what examples there are, and this book that I sent out to you actually gives you some of those examples that you can take with you as sort of templates, but it's all going to be about setting up your own sort of system. We're going to talk about some of the more common hazards and conditions in play environments, whether that's with the play equipment or safety surfacing. The things that you tend to see often, and keep an eye out for, and that'll give you a little sort of a guidebook on that. And then talk about various programs that can be set up long term. Again, thank you for being here. You're part of the solution in making sure the play areas are hazard-free and safe, to preserve that play environment and to continue to help children grow and promoting play value. So, okay, so why is inspection and maintenance important? I think all of us here, and I know a lot of you do play inspections. In fact, I think right when I got on, Lori from the Tacoma Pierce County Health Department was on doing the presentation prior, and I've actually met Lori out on site multiple times in the middle of a playground inspection, and so I know that she is very, very skilled and knowledgeable in that realm as well when it comes to kind of looking at the various aspects of inspecting a play space. But this is kind of an interesting fact that 33% of the playground accidents can be avoided with a planned maintenance program. So injuries are going to happen. We understand that. That's sort of natural. Ironically, for someone in this field, I had 2 different bones broken on 2 different occasions on play equipment and growing up as a kid. So I'm very aware that there's still the danger, but when I look back, it's interesting that on the 2 different incidents that occurred when I was growing up with different bone breaks and injuries, both would have been avoidable with today's current standards. I'm at the age where we had a climber over asphalt, and I fell and broke an arm on the asphalt because we didn't have adequate safety surfacing at the school that I went to as a young kid. And then another one, we had like a climbing pole, and I was 3 years old. And as you know, in the course, that the climbing pole or fire pole, whatever you want to call it, is not an acceptable play feature for the 2 to 5 or preschool age group. And so again, had they been up to current codes, potentially those injuries might have been avoided. But the additional items is to protect your investment. When schools make these capital improvements to their spaces, it's a very large investment. I mean, some of these things, when you're doing a turnkey play area, including all new equipment, safety surfacing, and installation costs, prevailing wages, et cetera, can be very expensive, and we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so part of this is to make sure that we're keeping on top of that and protecting that investment that is being put into these schools. Part of it is managing risk. Part of it's improving children's play experience. Having a safe space where it flows easy and doesn't have adverse risk is going to be part of that overall environment. And then we're going to be controlling future expenses. If you stay on top of these play spaces and you make sure they're maintained concurrently, then you have less chance of having like large expenses later if you let things slip over the years than have to do maintenance and upkeep once every 10 years instead of keeping it concurrent. So with some of the things that we go through when it comes to our management and staffing is that we want to make sure that, and I know some of you are doing this when the Department of Health has a lot of the process in the front end, right? When it comes to diving into the designs and making sure that all the different products meet IPEMA and have all the certifications and that the safety surfing is adequate and that everything is installed per code and per manufacturer's recommendations. And then a lot of this is also what then gets turned over, to each of the individual schools and districts of like what they then need to set into place, right? When it comes to, hey, now that this is set, we know what the baseline is, we have it inspected, now we're going to need to maintain it. And how do we go about doing that? And it's going to be making sure that you have an educated staff I know on multiple occasions, here in Washington and other places, we've, hosted various training events that are kind of in between a certified playground safety inspector and this. So it's kind of that, like a day and a half, 2-day course of really getting into the weeds of playground inspection and maintenance, and having the maintenance crews go through that certification process to make sure that they're identifying hazards as well. And so there are different ways to continue to educate those that are managing the play spaces to make sure that they're adequately equipped to be able to do so. And this is where we have into inspections. So there's just to clarify, right? There's a few different types of inspections. There is a initial audit or inspection that can be done, and here in Washington, that through the Department of Health, I know is required on public schools, in public parks, or other things. Is actually not a requirement. There's one state, the state of California is the only state that requires that there be a certified playground safety inspector to inspect every play space before it's open to the public. Here in Washington, that's not the case, but there are guidelines and there are these codes that we'd like to adhere to regardless, to make sure that we're meeting all the standards of care. And when you do inspections, a lot of this stuff will coincide with the certified playground safety inspector, right? Where it's you have the main three things that they typically talk about is the possibility of an injury, the probability of an injury, and the consequence of an injury. And so we're going to look at some of those. But when you set up a maintenance inspection setup, you're going to want to have either low frequency and high frequency inspections. Okay, so what that basically means is if you have a high frequency inspection, and in this sheet that I sent out to everybody, the guidebook, we'll show some examples. A high frequency inspection would be something where the staff that's maintaining that play space would do on a daily or weekly basis. That's something where they go around, they check. It usually is a very quick kind of cursory overview of the play space, making sure that there's no loose bolts, or nothing's broken or fallen off, or that the surfacing's at the right depth. Sort of your quick walkthrough guide to make sure there's nothing glaring or obvious that needs to be handled immediately. And then you do low frequency inspections, and again, these are all up to each individual agency on how they set them up. But a low frequency inspection would be quarterly or semi-annually, and that's going to be where you actually come in and do a more robust audit. And so those, if you're going to be doing, it's recommended that there's at least one on every staff of a certified playground safety inspector. Not everyone needs to be certified to be doing these inspections. Obviously, you just have inspections that are going to make sure in your standard of care while you go through and inspect and maintain your play spaces. But to have a CPSI on staff to help, having that finer knowledge is usually recommended as well. Here's an example of a low frequency. So this would be the one where you would go in and just dive right into all the different elements, right? Where you're looking at stuff at a very intense level. And a lot of times so again, you can see this is an example that's in that guidebook. It's just sort of a checklist of things, and you can set up your own. Most folks have their own sort of guidebook, but it's amazingly important to keep records of every single high frequency and low frequency inspection for risk management, to have the backup and information to showcase that you're staying on top of your maintenance is very pivotal to maintaining your space and keeping risk minimal, as well as protecting yourself against any sort of liability. So again, this just kind of dives through various checking of this, that, and the other in a high frequency, in a low frequency inspection. High frequencies, you can see a little bit more, simplistic, just making sure there's not any, hey, just checking on the quick things. The drainage is fine. The surfacing is the right depth. There's nothing broken. There's nothing missing. There's no, parts falling off or whatever. And these are the quick little overviews when you do a more of a daily or weekly inspection versus, the in-depth, really diving into that play space. And then everyone, typically recommend that you have your own sort of codes, when you're doing this. And again, feel free to utilize these sheets or, create your own or kind of spin off of these. It's a resource for you and your team to have as sort of a backup, but you can just make sure you're coding everything, right? Like, hey, we're all good. Hey, we've got an issue. And then when we complete the issue, to just continue, get in the habit and know that these entities get in the habit of being very fastidious when it comes to recording, and keeping these records on hand and in perpetuity, so that we know, that you again are showcasing that you're maintaining these areas properly for liability purposes. So this is where we get into some of the direct common things you tend to see. When you're doing a high frequency inspection and you're going around and you're just kind of walking around a play space, you want to look to see that there's no damaged parts, there's nothing loose, there's nothing missing, there's nothing that's bent. I don't know how many times I've seen over the years where, a mower or somebody doing some work accidentally backs into a play equipment and bends it or something. And so that can be something that is a common occurrence as well. So just kind of keeping sure there wasn't some sort of outside factor that came in and has caused something to be non-compliant. Also, this is an important one that's free from user modifications or foreign objects. And again, normally I'm doing this in person and we're kind of, having questions and answering and stuff. So it's a little bit of a different format for me, and I apologize for that in advance. That's a little bit more of me speaking instead of kind of interacting. But a lot of folks have what's known as track rides or zip lines or something, right? And I don't know. I've seen a lot of those in the region. And it's amazingly common to where, hey, we have this track ride, right? And a track ride or zip line type thing can be this long track, and they've got, an overhead where a child can grab and then kind of hang on to it as it zips them across to the other side. Very popular piece. We see it very often, and it's a great, has a great play value, but they're meant for 5 to 12-year-olds. Well, I don't know, almost every other time I would go to a site that has one of those zip tracks, I'll see, like a chair or something or a table from the school where they drug it out there because the little kids are too short to reach up and grab it. So they're basically pulling in these chairs or something to set it underneath it so they can get the smaller kids that are not age appropriate to be able to reach and utilize that zip track. And so that's the type of thing that you need to make sure when you're doing your inspections and when you various entities are going out and walking and supervising, that we understand that it's meant to not be there for a reason, right? That we have certain age groups, and that if you're bringing in a chair to stand on to be able to reach this, it's a hazard in case a child falls off, hits their head on the chair, the table, desk, or whatever. That's not meant to be there, but secondly, that it's not there for a reason. So that's when they kind of talk about some of the foreign objects you see, and it's a fairly common thing. And so keep that in mind when you're doing walks, that comes up fairly often. Again, when you're going out and looking at play spaces, I usually recommend to start again doing a cursory look, free from foreign objects, but moving parts. Moving parts will always deteriorate faster than static parts. So if they're dynamic, they're going to have movement, and it's going to have more areas for wear. And so swings, for example, are a prime area to look at when you go there. And swings actually are meant in a lot of cases to wear at those points of wear, and so you can keep an eye on it and know when you need to swap out. Hey, we need to swap out these clevises, or we need to swap out this chain or whatever. And it's meant to wear, but it also, these are the places you want to look first, is areas with moving parts. Hazardous materials, you'll see this a lot of times. There could be anything from garbage to animal waste that you want to just kind of stay on top of, make sure that's cleaned out and that it's not within that play space. Sadly, in some areas, I'll never forget walking a site in downtown Los Angeles, and it was next to what's a famous area known as Skid Row in downtown Los Angeles, and they had this daycare sort of attached to the mission there, and they wanted to add a metal roof over the playground that slanted out over the wall. And it was just kind of a unique request. And they said it was because they were getting a lot of needles thrown up over the wall into the play area. And they wanted to have a metal roof that basically caught those needles and then slid them back out of the play area over the wall again. And that was kind of a sad reality, right, of some of the things you have to deal with when it comes to outside environment. And so, again, not where we want to be or ideal, but you got to think about where some of these hazard materials and make sure we're staying on top of watching that. Another quick, easy one, make sure there's proper labeling. This is required by ASTM and CPSC, that the age for that group is identified. Typically, it's required to have it on an entrance, an access and egress points, but you can put them on multiple other, if you have freestanding elements, it's recommended to have them on those as well, so you know what that particular freestanding element age range and recommendation is. Those signs and labels all should have the warnings about falls over a hard surface. There's also signs and labels about hot surfaces, about drawstrings and helmets. So there's standards that are in the codes, and it's every manufacturer. So if you have a certain playground, any manufacturer is going to have stickers that are going to address those. It's also required per code to have the manufacturer identified. So for example, here you would have the age appropriate. This one is actually 2 to 12. This particular piece, for example, that they're showing in this picture, and that it's appropriate for the full age range of 2 to 12. Manufactured by Game Time, so it gives you the manufacturer and their contact information in case there is a need to get in contact with them, and then it gives you the warning labels. So another one is these are stickers, and these are readily available. Any manufacturer will have them, and you can just request, hey, you know what, our sticker's peeled off or whatever, and you should be able to request from the manufacturer of that equipment, and they should be able to send you out those stickers immediately, and you can just slap them on. Just make sure you have the order information and the details of that particular unit, so they give you the stickers that adhere to the age group for that piece. And then you can also do independent freestanding signage, so that actually is permanent. So when the entrance, then usually recommended again at the entrance to each of the play spaces, that there be some permanent signage. Not required, you just need to have some signage, but a permanent sign is easier long-term durability, because some of the stickers tend to peel off over time or weather, etc. So, but again, this is one of the quick, easy things when you're doing your cursory walks and your high-frequency inspections. Another one is crush and shear hazards. This is an example of one. They're showing a picture. And again, you'll learn a lot of this stuff if you were to go through the Certified Playground Safety Inspector course of these different type of dowels when it comes to checking crush and shear hazards. But just note some of the high areas of concern. So this is what we're kind of going over, some of the areas that tend to be commonly common issue. Is this was one. Again, usually I'd be like, who has this, cladder bridge or suspension bridge or something. It's a very common piece of equipment with all manufacturers in the playground world, and that they have included there. And this is an example of one where over time that particular as it just continues to get used, it slowly starts to kind of sag down and continue to get further away. And the second that it gets far enough away to where you have that crush and shear hazard, then it needs to be addressed. So just know this is like a cladder bridge is one that tends to be, because again, moving part, dynamic, it tends to have wear and tear faster than static pieces. So this is one piece of equipment that tends to get replaced more regularly than others, because it does end up having a hazard after a certain amount of time. So keep that in mind. Seesaws are another example of moving parts, dynamic parts are going to require more attention. And so just kind of keep that in mind when looking at these. As you would learn in the CPSI course, the Certified Playground Safety Inspector course, the number one cause of injuries are falls. So you see more cause for injury from a fall onto a hard surface than you do than any other hazard in a play space. And we're going to talk about surface in a second. But the number one cause of serious injury or death on a play space is entanglements. So again, when you talk about the possibility, the probability, and the consequence, when you're looking at these play spaces, the consequence of an entanglement is the highest potential risk when it comes to a hazard one, because there's the possibility of serious injury or death. So that's why when we talk about entanglements, that's a big deal. What entanglements can be, if, for example, you have a swing with an S hook, okay? Now, these S hooks have certain regulations where the gap on the S hook should be no more than 0.04 inches. They basically say that's about the size of a dime, the thickness of a dime. So if you have a dime and you're checking these S hooks, then if the dime can go through, then technically it's beyond the threshold of what the code dictates, okay? And there's the possibility of, a drawstring or something kind of getting into that gap and becoming a strangle point. That's the same with gaps at slide entrances, okay? They don't have, it's not the same ratio of 0.04 inches like it is on an S hook. But you want to make sure that these gaps are as minimal as possible and flush. So again, a child sitting down, perhaps has a drawstring, maybe they're turned to their side and something gets caught in there, like a drawstring maybe can slip through the side here and then get caught underneath. And as the child goes down, they could potentially be, in a stranglement sort of situation. So again, I know that everyone does a great job of trying to stay on top of this and maintaining it, and I don't want to get too severe, but there are quite severe consequences with some of these safety regulations if they're not managed properly, which is why we do what we do, to try to keep kids safe. So just not get too serious about it, but just want to just reiterate that this is a very serious matter when it comes to the safety of these play spaces. Again, anything where you see the code says if you have more than 2 threads, you can have 2 threads exposed and it's no problem. If you have more than 2 threads exposed, then that can be a protrusion risk, right? So something where it could potentially project into like an eyeball or a temple or anything. So just make sure that there's all these different, I guess I'll show this now. Gauges and stuff. So when we're talking about protrusions, this is another. So again, entanglements are the number one cause of potential death. So the consequences are the most severe when it comes to entanglement. But projections or protrusions or anything that stick out, that could be on a vertical plane or something where a child would run and, they could hit their head and they could have a projection that would, maybe their temple or into their eye socket or something, so it can still cause serious injury. So there are For those that are certified playground safety inspector, and I'm just gonna, can everyone see this? I guess I don't know, but I'm assuming that you can. This is the like an inspection kit. Again, this one's kind of over the top,
It's showing
fancy
up in
pants.
the, yeah, it's a little blurred since your blurred background,
Okay.
unfortunately.
So
Yeah.
in essence, like there's an inspection kit that can be had for a certified playground safety inspector. And this one is like in brushed aluminum, spun aluminum, whatever, and it's got all the head probes and the torso probes and all the other different things. Um, this is the gauge for that we're showing right here for protrusions. So there's all sorts of different things. These are available in a lot of different locations. This is kind of, like I said, a little bit over the top, sort of high-end spun aluminum version. There's a lot of different versions. For those that are a certified playground safety inspector, I highly recommend, that you have one on hand just so you can kind of double check when you're doing your inspections. So this goes to give you an example of that. But okay, here we are. So again, I showed that sort of gauge, and this is what they're using it for, is checking to see if any of these inspections, if they go past these gauges, depending on the size, then there can be a reason for risk, right? And again, some of this can be a very quick, easy fix. Swapping out this nut with a different nut that's sticking out too far, or replacing your swing seats if they tend to have this diameter gauge and they have a sharp piece that's kind of sticking out past it. So these are things you learn in that certified playground safety inspector course, or in some of these other courses. We don't diving into the fine lines on all these, but just kind of showcasing some of these highlighted where you can look and see more regular issues. So a lot of this stuff could be certain common sense, right? Like you're walking around and you see, a doubled up nut sticking out a certain amount. You can basically say, well, this could be a protrusion. Like you don't need a gauge to look at this and say, well, that could be a problem. And so just keep in mind when you're looking at stuff, there's real simple things, right? Like this is a very common to see cracks that can become sharp edges or points, or places where, you could get clothing or whatever stuck into certain cracks. So if you see these, then they'll want to be addressed. This is just a quick reference chart. It's also in that guidebook that was provided, basically showing you if you have a projection that has this type of diameter and extends this amount, then it's a hazard. So basically, if you've got the smaller diameter and something's able to fit through there, but then extends out past this amount with the smaller diameter, then it's a projection for this hazard. If you've got the second probe and it's it's a 1.5 inch diameter, and you've got something that's able to fit through that, and it sticks out 3/4 of an inch, then it's a hazard. And so you kind of just can go through and use these gauges to make sure that what you have is a hazard or not. And then one of the other areas to keep in mind, and in modern day, the good news is that for the most part, all this stuff is addressed in the manufacturing process, right? And so if everything is manufactured properly and it's installed properly, there should be no issues with codes, with safety hazards, because again, the liability in the manufacturers to make sure that everything is manufactured and shipped out properly, and the installation team is to do it properly, then you would theoretically not have anything that's against current codes. However, some things get missed. It's just the way of the world, where there may be something that's a hazard that gets missed through engineering. Otherwise, a lot of times it could be on installation, like where the installer doesn't follow the manufacturer's instructions, or there's a lot of cases where folks will, have a bid for a installation and it's just, a low bidder situation that doesn't know anything about the safety standards of installing a play space. And so they'll do that, but then they'll end up having a lot of different issues because they don't know the code. So just kind of keep in mind on the front end that you really want folks who, if you're going to be doing play spaces that are certified and that have experience in those certifications to understand the codes to try to limit risk. A head entrapment hazard, this kind of gives you an example, but really what it is if you have a situation where your body, and what they use is the 5 percentile body versus the 95th percentile head of your average, 2 to 5 or sorry, 2 to 12-year-old. So what that's saying is that the smallest 5% body of a 2-year-old is this big, right? It's 3.5 inches is what anthropometrics would suggest based upon the data. Whereas in the largest head of a 12-year-old is 9 inches. Okay, so really what it's saying is that they're going the extremes to kind of explain that. So that, if a body that's 3.5 inches could slide through an opening, and then the head that's attached to that body that's 9 inches wide won't fit through that opening, then all of a sudden you've got yourself a head entrapment, which is basically a body can fit through the opening, just like, example here, where a body can fit through it, but the head doesn't. So there's both completely bound openings, right, where it's bound on all sides. It's bound on all sides, where a body could fit through, a head couldn't, which could become a stranglement or entrapment hazard. Then there's partially bound openings where you have these, whether it's fence or whether it's something, again, this is a rough example, but in certain play pieces, there could be some unique climber or something where a child could slip through, and they have different tests and probes. This is an example again of those probes I was showing, where, if a body could fit through, but then the head couldn't fit through, then that's a potential head entrapment. So that's just giving an example of what those probes would test, right? So whether you're going to put the probe through, but then the head can't go through, then it could potentially be a hazard. Again, you could have these probes, or tape measure can also suffice if you just know the measurements of between 3.5 to 9 inches. But here's an example of the kit that I was showing. You've got your probe here, which is your torso probe. You have your head probe. You have your various gauges. This is what some call the fish probe, and that's to test various non-completely bound openings. So if you've got like I said, like pickets on a fence or something that's more like, a little U shape, and if the neck can get trapped in there and then the head can't, then that's potentially a hazard. So they also include this, and they have this here for when you're looking at things now, that's for a fully enclosed rigid opening. But in a lot of cases today, especially a lot of the new trends and stuff in the play environment are having these big, cable or net climber type situations, and they're going to have openings as well. And when you're testing those, you need to apply 50 pounds of pressure. So, with the fully bound rigid openings, it's just the probes. If it's a non-rigid opening, so you've got something, whether it's like a belt material or a net climber, something that's not fully rigid, if you can still, fit the body through at a 50-pound pressure and then not fit the head through at a 50-pound pressure, then you still got yourself a hazard. Or if you can, or if the body goes through and the head goes through at 50-pound pressure, then you don't. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at head entrapments and having the probes. A lot of different things to keep an eye on. There's a lot of different, again, fabricators that do things, whether it's a direct bolt system or whether these are called clamps system. So you have post and clamps. Just note when you're doing a post and clamp system that they have a lot of these structural areas will have a drive rivet, and you want to make sure that those, I think this is an example of one that seems to be missing on a deck system. So what that could potentially do is allow for slippage, and there'll be a picture here later. So that's a real big thing you want to keep an eye on when you're looking at these different play spaces, is if you'll see any movement, because if something is compliant at the start, but then it moves later, then it could become uncompliant. So, or non-compliant, excuse me. Again, when you're doing a frequency, these are very common things. Just bolts can get loose. You know, sometimes there'll be requirements often for manufacturers to say, hey, you need to put in Loctite when they're installing these and make sure that it's fully engaged. But sometimes either it's not done, or sometimes stuff just finds a way to work itself loose, especially in dynamic pieces. So, you know, this just quick cursory, hey, that bolt's loose. You know, there's most play spaces, they'll leave behind, you know, hardware kits that have the appropriate tools for, you know, they should have a lot of these tools that are going to use like a button head system or something that's going to make it easier or make it so that it's like tamper proof, tamper resistant. So you should have the appropriate tools to be able to fix those. Real easy. Again, when you do cursory knowledge, you can see, oh, obviously that's broken, that needs to be fixed. Obviously we're missing a cap, that we need to figure that out. These are quick, easy things as you're going around and checking fasteners. You know, if you've got, you know, turnbuckles on these new net structures, make sure that they're tightened. Typically, you only have to do that once a year or so to make sure that everything's sort of tightened back up and not loose. Because they, you know, when they're installed and tightened, they may meet code, but if they get loose, then they could potentially become a hazard again. So make sure you're staying on top of various connection points, and that everything is put together that way. This is what I was mentioning earlier. It's pretty obvious to see when you're walking around and seeing this. Like this is one where, you know, their rivet went missing or broke or whatever, and so you see this gap, right? And this gap right here. So originally when this was installed and it was clamped up here, then it met code. Over time, when it slipped down, now all of a sudden you have this gap here and it's an entrapment hazard. So it's easy to see sometimes just by looking at it that, you know, this is something that needs to be addressed. A lot of real quick, easy things when you're going around and looking. You see right here, if you see anything with exposed concrete, that's an obvious issue that needs to be addressed. You know, we have an exposed concrete where a child could fall and hit their head, something like that. So that should be something that gets in repair. Again, moving pieces like spring toys tend to have, you know, break down faster. So dynamic pieces need more help. Hand grips, when you have your stepping and hand grip components, just want to make sure they're tight, that everything is stable, clean. Try to be as risk-free as possible. Everything's in good condition. For slides, one of the main, when you're taking a CPSI course, one of the main things is you can't have an entanglement within 21 inches. It's like putting like a barrier, like you have like the child sits on a slide, you've got a 21-inch sort of bubble that goes around them from the bedway of the slide up and around in a bubble. So and we'll see this sometimes. I mean, again, we're not going into all the in-depth code stuff today, but where, you know, especially older stuff before this code was invented, where there may be like a climber or something where it within 21 inches to where if like a child puts their hand out or they were to put their head out, they could hit that on the way down. That's why they have this slide clearance zone to make sure that there's nothing within that sort of bubble. Also make sure, because you see stuff, and again, over the years, it's really been kind of sad, some of the things we've seen, and this is why it's important to make sure, when you're inspecting these, that you're maintaining it. But, we've seen stuff gets lodged into tube slides or into sections. So you got to make sure that that's clean and free of debris. Otherwise you can hit it. There was a sad case a couple of years ago in San Diego, California, where someone went and they taped razor blades to some of the pieces. Now, again, I don't know what would try someone to do something like that. It just is awful. But this is why it's important to try to make sure we stay on top of inspections, because you never know what the outside factors may be as well. So, swing and move components, again, very common. These are ones that you're going to see a lot with wear and tear because of the dynamic. You'll see, if you see something, it's going to be wearing down. You see the bushings inside of this fastener. It's like, this is where it's like, hey, we need to get some new swings, some new chain, or whatever. So again, it's very quick, easy. Most of the stuff is fairly economical when it comes to the swing parts. So just make sure you stay on top of that. You can have extras on hand, whether that's clevises or S-hooks or various fasteners or seats, but this is the stuff that tends to wear the fastest. So keep an eye on the connection points. And when they get to a point like this, it has this internal brass bearing on these, for example. When it gets to a point where that's gone, it's time to be replaced. Otherwise, you're looking at a potential cracking and failure. So swings are wonderful. Kids love them. I mean, they're a great play medium, but they do take extra space for one, surfacing for another, and maintenance for a third. So same with a lot of these different other pieces. Swing, there's tire swings, there's big disc swings now in the industry, and there's a lot of different features. So making sure that, again, watching any of the parts that have moving parts, that they're good to go. This is kind of a new thing. It's funny, wood play pieces were pretty big in the 90s, early 2000s, and then you didn't see a whole lot of wood for a while, and it's kind of made a resurgence. There's a lot more, especially in the Pacific Northwest, there's sort of a lot more natural play spaces with wood features, etc. So if you see that, just know that there's going to be some more maintenance over time, making sure there's no splinters, digging up underneath and making sure there's no rotting, especially where it meets an underground tends to be an area where things can rot when it comes to wood. So just understand there's going to be some more maintenance on that when you see anything that needs to be addressed. Obviously, graffiti is a common occurrence, unfortunately, so do your best to maintain that. If you see any sort of rust, it should be free of rust. If you see it, I mean, most manufacturers will have touch-up paint and things where you can get rid of the rust and touch it up and cover it up as well, just trying to stay on top of those things. If you see any areas where you've got broken welds, then that would also be addressed also. One other very, very common thing you see is, most playground equipment manufacturers will have a deck system with a PVC or vinyl coating on top of it. The vinyl coating is usually there just as an effort to keep the heat, so that if those flat decks if they were just metal exposed, they could get very hot. So they put the vinyl coating on it. But over time, you can see, especially in a lot of surfaces, where it starts to peel. And that's a common thing, especially in areas that had like sand or pea gravel, as kids, are stepping up and rubbing up against that. It can be a common place for deterioration. So just keep in mind, it's not necessarily that it's per code if you have an opening like this, but you can't have any sharp, jagged edges or any trip hazards. So if you see it start to peel, you usually just kind of cut along the bottom, and then you can, touch up paint, make sure there's no rust or whatever, as long as there's not a hazard, to just stay on top of that, because that's a very common one to see. Again, a lot of this stuff is pretty self-explanatory. When you're doing your high frequency inspections, just make sure that there's free from trash, broken glass. if you have any issues like during the winter, I highly recommend if it's under freezing that you know don't actually have your playground open because your safety surfacing will not meet the compact attenuation in a frozen environment. So I know that can come up from time to time in some regions. Um, I would highly recommend that you know during those winter weather situations where it's under freezing that the kids don't go play on it because if they were to have a fall and they were to land on the surfacing, but it's a frozen surfacing, then there is zero compact attenuation. There's no difference as a kid falling onto concrete, and there can be a much higher risk of or possible and potential of a risk for injury.
Taylor, I'm going to jump in and give you an 8-minute cue. You're doing
Okay.
great. Keep going though.
Yeah, no worries. So again, as you're kind of looking at this in closing, I mean, there's required maintenance. If you have to do maintenance, it depends on the type of maintenance. You know, construction fencing gets put up. You can caution things off depending on how long things are going to be out of service. But we highly recommend if it's going to be, you know, a long period of time to put up adequate barriers, especially if you're going to keep the existing play space open. I mean, you're just going to block off a certain piece, that you have something that can be done when you're going to be doing the maintenance just to keep it safe. Again, cleanliness and sanitation is important when you're maintaining these areas to stay on top of that. We're going to skip some of the stuff there. Again, there's a lot of different stuff out there. If you're going to be doing stuff, like I mentioned, you can get Plastisol for those decks. You can get graffiti removers. You can get touch-up paint. Signage you should be able to get from any manufacturer that's going to be appropriate for that particular piece of equipment. Swing parts and everything like that. Again, very ubiquitous. These are parts that can be found, you know, almost anywhere with any manufacturer of like, hey, we're going to need to get this clamp or we're going to get this clevis. There's all those parts that are available. And then the very last little section here is on surfacing. And I'll just give like I said, a very quick rundown on surfacing. There is no perfect safety surfacing. There's just pros and cons. And I've been involved in doing safety surfacing now for almost 30 years. And we've seen a lot of evolution in various types of surfacing and sort of regional and what people use and don't use. But yeah, there's no perfect, excuse me. There's no perfect surface. So what we do know is that, you know, having certain, there is a requirement for surface, as I mentioned before, with my poor 3-year-old's broken arm and legs. When you're playing on an area that doesn't have appropriate safety surfacing, you have a higher risk of injury. So grass, exposed concrete, hard earth, compacted earth, etc., are not accepted surfacing. This is an example of like people bringing that chair over, by the way. But when you're looking at surfacing here, most fabricators will actually show you, they'll have some sort of a sticker or signage to show where the expected finish grade is. And so the surfacing, you know, that gives you an idea of where if you have loose fill surfacing, it should be filled up to that line, for example. So just kind of keep in mind different types of surfacing. This pour in place rubber, this wood fiber. Again, you need to make sure that we have adequate surfacing that's maintained throughout the area. Some things, wood fiber meets ADA as well. If you have the engineered wood fiber, wood chips, loose fill rubber chips, pea gravel, they do not meet ADA. And then you've got unitary surfacing, pour in place, bonded, tile, synthetic grass that can meet ADA. They're permanent. Again, pros and cons. Wood fiber is more economical. Some of these are more expensive, significantly more expensive up front. Perhaps have less maintenance issues, etc. So there's just a lot of pros and cons, and you can talk to your local folks who supply these that can give you a lot of different information on that. But just got to make sure that no matter what, that it maintains its compact attenuation, and that understand that organic materials are going to decompose, so they're going to need to be maintained and topped off and raked and everything at a more common common time frame. So whereas in things like sand and stuff doesn't necessarily need to be topped off, except for it's going to walk away, and you're still going to need to figure out how to get it in there. These are some charts there in your book, so you can reference those when it comes to comes from the CPSC of different depth of materials and what that critical fall height is. But again, this is a chart that kind of gives you some minimum tests, but each individual surfacing is going to have its own testing and IPMA certifications, and you can do tests in the field, the drop test, so you can make sure that it meets those in the field. Again, unitary surfacing, a lot of different options, and there's pros and cons to all those. Just make sure that to maintain ADA, you have to be 2% or less with the cross slopes and running slope not to exceed 1/16. Just understand that your maintenance may not be immediate, like every year you have to top off wood chips, but they do recommend things like roll coats and when you have synthetic turf to go out and you have to add infill and brooming and all that kind of stuff. So there is additional maintenance that needs to be done as well long term. So most all this stuff, I mean, you can Google the Customer Product Safety Commission, the Consumer Product Safety Commission. Yeah, that's a typo. And they'll give you this handbook. You can just download a PDF version of this and have it available. There's also the ASTM, various codes for F1492, F1951 for ADA, etc. So these are all these resources that are available. And again, we're not going to get into some of these other ones when it comes to natural play environments and such, but just understand that if you have any questions, there's a lot of different elements that go into the codes. So I use the resources you have available, whether that's your certified playground safety inspectors that are that are already certified within your departments or schools, or you can reach out to various vendors who do this on daily, where they have a lot of resources as well that they can share. So, all right, thank you very much.